Now, with this newly revised rule, it seems as though the changes are rather minimal, but the implication of the changes is going to be revolutionary. This is a rather quick shift from a hermit's way of life to a mendicant way of life. Father Joachim points out that although there were really no dissenting opinions on the changes, it's still going to take until the end of the century. So maybe give it 50 years to actually take root. These were gradual modifications in people's ways of living. Some of them hung on to the older, more familiar ways on into several decades later, which was quite all right because that meant that the changes were going to be natural. But they were made, and eventually by the end of the century, we have hermits continuing to live a desert spirituality, but in an urban setting. Even the hermitages in the remote areas would have a common refectory, prayer together in chapel with the full office, and so forth. Now, just to kind of review the modifications that would have been necessary, we have the changes that our friend Innocent IV is going to allow. Change situations means that we can accept houses that were not in eremis. In other words, the wild areas that were not part of the saculum. Okay? We also have a changed status. So we are going to be matching a lot of what happens with the other communities. So the Franciscans and the Dominicans already have their established ways of life, and we simply move into them. And then finally, we have a common life, which means more adapting to what we call conventuality. The common life is going to draw the former hermits together. They were individual praying people back in the wadi. So, with the changed status, we're going to have travel taken for granted. In other words, just being out of the Holy Land means that they are now in a much bigger Europe. And so, with houses in towns and cities, as well as hermitages out in the countryside, there was much more mobility between one community and another. Just the fact that those animals have become so important, relatively speaking, is part of the equation. The dietary restrictions were loosened, especially for people traveling. Among other things, Patrick tells the story that most people at this time were living quite simply. Even some of the professional classes, in addition to working class folks, would normally have single dish meals without too much variety. He refers to peas porridge as a common thing for most families. A working class family would have a single big kettle on the fireplace all the time, 24/7. The fire was never hot enough, most cases, to burn the food inside. And the lady of the house would be continually putting things into this pot and having it heat gradually but continually. Most of what went in there would have been vegetables of one sort or another, peas, beans, legumes of various sorts, lentils if they're available, together with root vegetables, onions, garlic, carrots, turnips. No potatoes, they're not in from the Americas just yet. But very little meat. But whatever meat they did have available would be small cuts, or in some cases, a large amount from one butchered animal that had to be cooked and eaten quickly so that it didn't spoil. This was usually put into the pot and continued to heat day after day. And at mealtime, the lady of the house would simply ladle out bowls full of this peas porridge, and together with perhaps bread, if available, or other things, this would be the main source of their nutrition. Now, if a mendicant friar is traveling and is asked by a charitable family to come and stay with us, we'll feed you, we'll give you a place to stay, you can do your preaching or your begging whenever you are able to, but we'll give you a place to stand. Well, it would be highly ungracious for this particular mendicant to say, well, you've got meat in that pot and I can't eat it, so make me a special diet, hopefully something that's gluten-free. I mean, this is the height of ingratitude to good people. And so the rule states that so as to be good to your hosts, eat what they put before you. Same as what St. Paul tells people. The dietary restrictions are loosened when it's necessary to eat what you get while traveling. Especially travel by sea would include a very hard bread for the most part, preserved in cracker-like chunks for the duration of the voyage, and frequently salted meat. It would be frequently beef or pork. Salted fish would not be a problem for people with a meatless diet, but again, it's eat what's available or go hungry. And as we know, Albert's rule was not designed to increase people's suffering. And then finally, the easing of silence. Remember that we originally had a kind of broad swath of the evening hours with no talking. This is shortened somewhat in the new monastic situation, but it is also enforced a bit more strictly. We assume that people living in a large building and having dealings with one another, if necessary during nighttime, this should be done easily. Albert's basic rule is don't make problems where they don't exist. Now, the changed status of former hermits now living in a common building, these new regulations help them to conform to what people in other religious communities would have expected. This is especially significant in the case of possible vocations to the community. If the legal parameters of the Carmelites are not that terribly far distant from the Dominicans or the Augustinians, at least the people trying to decide on a future life for themselves won't have to worry about all kinds of physical details. It's more important for them to select a Carmelite way of life, for example, because of spirituality or community features, not legality. And of course, one of the things that the popes and those two Dominican advisors would have been concerned about would have been conformity to canon law. If this new family is going to be a mendicant order, then we need certain features that are now characteristic of their way of life. A religious order requires 3 vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience. You remember that Albert's original rule simply called people to be obedient to the prior. Now, the implication was that chastity and poverty were part of that obedience. It's not as though there was only one vow. But if you buy into the package deal, you buy into everything. But for the safety of canon law, the specified 3 vows were necessary. And of course, now that the community is back in Europe with the availability of choir books, still very big and very expensive, but accessible, they were now expected to say the full office, together with the variable readings, petitions, orations, variable parts according to the feast of the day or the season. So it wasn't just the Psalms any longer. This would have been one area that probably would have taken the rest of the century in many communities to actually acquire these choir books so that the full office could be done. And naturally enough, when you start to plug in whatever ministry to the working poor in the neighborhood where these communities were founded, you're going to find it more useful to have certain members of the community ordained as priests. And this is going to begin a gradual transition from a largely lay community with a sprinkling of priests to one that was more priests than brothers in any given house. This wasn't a hard and fast rule by any means, but the mixture is going to be consistently going one direction. Now, as far as the common life is concerned, this must have been an interesting transition because you have all these rugged individualists who are now suddenly thrown together in a much closer existence. And we're going to see the growth of this thing called conventuality. Patrick gives you a definition here. Community members have more dealings with one another. There's another definition of conventuality that is not a very good one. That refers to a tendency of the community members to believe that they are members of one convent only and cannot be moved or transferred to somewhere else. That is a problem. Because if you're in a mendicant order, mobility is part of the mendicant way of life. Mendicants have to be willing and able to go where they are sent, wherever the superiors need them. So we're going to find, not in this period, because this was fine, but later on, centuries into the future, people will have a great deal of objection to being transferred out of their favorite house. And that's going to be reform material. We've already spoken about the common refectory with the same food for everyone. And this was normally accompanied by reading during meals. There are two reasons for that. One is that it was able to maintain a reflective silence. The other was that it was a good occasion for the contents of a holy book to be transferred to the entire community. Remember that all books, whatever the type, were somewhat rare, and many people in this age went through a whole long life without ever touching or seeing a book. And then we have the common office, including the proper readings, prayers, and antiphons. The Psalms are still there, but they've suddenly become very enriched by the variety of the liturgy. We're also going to have that shortened silence, Compline to prime rather than vespers to terce, but more strictly enforced. Okay, now also a caution that remember that not all changes are in the rule. From the individual hermitage to rooms with a convent, it means that we have a drastic reduction of personal space and a need for more formal structure in life. So unless it's going to be less spontaneous. Okay? That's not in the rule and really shouldn't be. But this was something that people had to get used to. As far as the formal structure of life, we have eating at the same time. This is different. I mean, people back in the Wadi would fix their own meals and they would eat them at a time to be determined by each individual. Well, now we're taking a page from the monk's existence. A bell rings at mealtime. Everyone goes into the dining room in a kind of preset sequence. There's usually a seating order based on seniority. You'll have common meal prayers. And before or after a meal, there will frequently be prayers in chapel. So getting to and from the chapel in order. Again, a seniority system is the traditional way of arranging who goes where. A lot of standardization of worship. And since the prayer of the community is now public, remember that they go into their church many times a day, but the doors are open and people are not only welcome but encouraged to come and pray along. There has to be a particular, predictable, formal ritualization of the routine aspects of life. So there's a lot of adapting necessary for this new wrinkle in Carmelite existence. Once you move into a built-up city, remember that all of these towns and cities at the time usually had walls around them. These were defensive walls that were quite necessary to remain safe. And any land inside the walls was going to be very much at a premium. So getting donated land from someone who had enough to share was a very good thing. If you're trying to establish yourself inside the walls, you may not be able to afford it. Now, that doesn't mean that all of the new foundations were inside. Many of the Carmelite foundations were outside the walls because that's all the areas that they would have available. It's interesting that in the city of Florence, although everything was inside the walls, the high rent district in Florence was north of the Arno River. That was where about 3/4 of the actual city was. And it was the place where most of the noble families and most of the commercial area was. South of the river was a nice annex area, but it was less desirable. To this day, if you go to Florence, you will find the Dominicans and the Franciscans on the north side with the majority of the population. The Carmelites and the Augustinians are on the south side. Those were the areas that were essentially the leftovers. And the orders that were coming later and with less resources had to be satisfied with something less. But just assume that these cities were crowded and for that reason largely vertical. A way of expanding your house capacity was to build upward rather than outward. Because in many cases for a monastery, if you have an enclosed cloister garden, you can build there, but you'd rather not, because this is fresh air, it's green grass, flowers, trees, reflectiveness, and so putting a second floor on the building or a third floor is much more desirable. Now, also count on smells and sounds of a noisy urban sector. You're physically closer to families. That's going to be a big complication because, just fall back on Teresa's family. They were always visiting and interfering with her life. They loved her dearly. They didn't think they were making troubles, but sometimes the concerns of her family kept getting in the way of her prayer. And yet, having a large number of people around will be a vocation source. And the question, as the final line indicates there, how do you grow without diluting the charism? Because the old hermits from the Wadi are going to be there in limited numbers, and they're gradually going to die out. How do you replace the gaps left by them, and lots more besides, with new people who don't have the experience of the old charism? Now, of course, once you're in an urban setting, you're moving from the countryside, how do you support yourself? Well, remember, these are not monks. They don't do farming. In the Wadi area, they had fruits and vegetables growing wild and a little bit better with encouragement and cultivation. And whatever they couldn't produce, they now needed to buy food and other goods. And of course, in the urban setting, they're going to need a lot more stuff. So turning to begging is one of the things that is necessary. I mean, mendicant means beggar. And since all the mendicant orders were not going to have large land holdings to support them, the only way that they could supply their needs, including the very large and awesome task of educating their young people, they had to either work or beg for what they needed. The psychology of begging is very simple. If the people of God consider this community worth keeping alive, even the poor will find a way. If not, if they're not serving the community, maybe they need to go hungry. Maybe they need to starve to death or go somewhere else. I mean, it's good old capitalist logic. You know, if you're worth keeping alive, the people in your neighborhood will do it. So honestly begging for help was considered not a source of shame, but a source of dependence on the goodness of the people. And they either responded or they didn't. The other way of supporting yourself was by the fruits of your own labor. This would include things like sacramental ministry, voluntary donations of people in your own church, if they liked the homilies, if they found a confessor that was particularly kind and sympathetic. All right, there were boxes that they could put money in. And of course, donating also for the help of the poor, since it's right in the Carmelite literature that you're not supposed to allow any donations to accumulate to a large amount. Whatever you don't actually need, you need to give away again. So that's one of those things that definitely keeps us honest. And then, of course, eventually university teaching is going to become a real hallmark of the mendicant orders. Now, within the urban community, there's going to be a variety of skills that the mendicants themselves will begin to develop. I mentioned preaching or teaching or hearing confessions. These were all ministries that each of the mendicant orders became very good at. And you'll find it interesting that although we assume today that anyone who is a priest, whether a religious order person or a diocesan, that they all hear confessions and preach and say Mass. That was not necessarily true in this age. Being able to preach, which in those days was considered to be an extremely important skill, and authorization to hear confessions and do it wisely, these were restricted functions. Not everyone got the automatic permission with being ordained by the bishop. And the people who were authorized either to do preaching in the house or, more importantly, outside of the house, had to have special qualifications, and they were generally authorized with a great deal of solemnity. Now, there was no doubt about it that from this point onward, we have the Carmelites being seen as religious. So they're living in a structured environment that is very much a team effort. And as a canonical order, they're centralized to a degree that the abbots and the monks' orders were not. And the centralization gave series of communities under a provincial a kind of a duplicate structure that resembled something with a bishop and multiple parishes under him. And because of the multiplicity of small communities, much smaller than the abbeys would have been, they're going to be held accountable to a province and ultimately a general, and chapters that melt periodically to sort of review leadership and discipline. Now, I mentioned conventuality a second ago about people being moved from one community to another. The conventuality in the bad sense means that individuals may resist that. This is going to be a large problem, because part of the advantage of the mendicant orders is from the point of view of the popes especially, and bishops to a second degree, is that they were available to be moved to wherever they were needed on short notice. This is going to be a big help to the universal church, especially when you talk about troubleshooting in areas where they may have less clergy or large problems with existing clergy, or especially for missionary efforts. If a mendicant provincial can order a dozen of his members to get up and move to a certain location, you can see why someone like a pope would find the Carmelites very, very useful. And of course that also implies more travel, because both the begging tours and the preaching tours are going to see friars in motion. They're away from their communities for days and weeks at a time. And whether they like it or not, living in a city where it's noisy and dirty and very distracting, it also makes them fellow citizens with the people in their neighborhoods. And they may not be as free from concerns of the saeculum that they might want to be. In other words, if there's a problem with drainage and sewage in a particular neighborhood, it's definitely to the advantage of the mendicants to lend a hand with the neighborhood people to solving the problem. If there's a high crime level, or if there's an outbreak of disease, it makes no sense for the mendicants to hide behind their walls and pretend they're out in the countryside. They have to get involved. One interesting thing about the urban existence is that I mentioned earlier, many of the religious, if they're in a house where they come from, in their own native place, they're going to have lots of friends and relatives nearby. That could be very useful for donations and gifts and freshly prepared good meals and things like that. But it's also a distraction in the spiritual side. Just having people that you know and people who are interested in you as a person, it can actually be very affirming in someone's ministry. But by the same token, it's going to create a sort of a conflict of interest that you will have to fight against. In many cases in these urban towns, the most important civic organizations were the guilds. Guilds for crafts workers or for merchants of a particular type. And every single guild wanted to have its own patron saint, its own religious rituals, its own favorite church where they could meet for their religious ceremonies, where they could have their own inaugurations of new officers and things of that sort. The mendicants were absolutely tailor-made for that function. Many of the leading families of a city would also have their favorite mendicant church where they would be donors and also have the ability to bury their members in the church or near it and have the members of the community remember their deceased members indefinitely. To this day, we are still very conscious of praying for our benefactors, and we should be. But just this fact, it made the mendicants very attractive to the leading families of a city. For example, the Carmelite church in Augsburg was the favorite family of the favorite praying place for the Fugger family, the bankers of Augsburg, who were essentially the German Medici and filthy rich. It was also the place where the Goldsmiths Guild had their chapel and their burial place. So these were complications that could be good or bad, but we generally would like to think that these were friendships that were encouraged for the most spiritual and noble reasons as well. It's also interesting that in these medieval cities, the communities themselves are going to take on a kind of a structured nature where the members of a community which had been largely harmonious and homogeneous, everyone equal to everyone else, they're now going to start diverging because of these city pressures. And according to the status, in other words, the ability to do preaching or confessing or not, the ability to read and write or not, the ability to be able to make contributions to the community that are beyond the ordinary. This will start creating tiers or strata within the community. And there still may be a level of great charity among the upper and lower members of the community. But you don't like to see too much diversity. Now, with all of the commercial world that we're dealing with here, most of these commercial cities, sooner or later, are going to have one or several mendicant houses that are right there in them. The four big mendicant orders are going to be very competitive with one another in trying to land establishments in the most important cities, and largely successful. Between the beginning of the century and the Second Council of Lyon, there are going to be other mendicant groups like the Pied Friars and the Sack Friars, who also will be establishing houses in these communities, even though they're going to be suppressed after Second Lyon and have to give up those communities. Now, of course, any of these cities that have, let's say, a pied friar house, if suddenly the order that lives there is suppressed by the church, the civic leaders are not going to want to lose their mendicant presence. And so it's very likely they're going to go looking for Augustinians or Franciscans to move into the house and take it over. And there are going to be a handful of pied friars who suddenly find themselves without a religious family to hang on. And some of them, at least, are going to be interested in renewing their vows according to the Dominican pattern or the Carmelite pattern, and staying in their old house and just joining the new community. So much of the expansion of the mendicant orders during this century is going to be quite dramatic, simply because everybody and their cousins in Europe wanted mendicant communities in their towns to pray for them and to provide good quality ministry. Now, of course, this is going to likewise be the background of many of the universities that will grow up in the medieval world. This is a university map. The various little colored symbols there indicate the age of each of the universities in those towns. Don't worry about the details of that. But whenever you have a university, you're definitely going to have a great deal of attractiveness for a mendicant community. Generally, the mendicant orders are going to buy into the universities, first of all, just to educate their young members. But eventually, as more and more of these young scholars prove to be very good, it's a very natural transition that they're going to just slide into positions of teaching and scholarship as well. And as part of that diversity within a community where you're having tiers of people who are upper and lower members of the community, probably the prime qualification for being part of the A team is to have a university degree. So this is going to be good news and bad news for the future. Out of all of the European universities, the University of Paris is going to be the one that stands head and shoulders above everyone else. Some of the other really good ones, like Oxford, like Salamanca, like Bologna, are going to come along in time and be very respectable. But it was generally admitted that a degree from Paris was worth more than exactly the same degree from any other school. We generally have 4 faculties, you and I would call them departments, in the University of Paris, and most of the others, some only had 3, but the basic faculty, the first one, would be the Faculty of Philosophy or the Faculty of the Arts. So everyone who began a university education started in that department. When they had completed their Bachelor of Arts degree, they could continue for an advanced degree in one of the other 3. Those were theology, canon law, and medicine. Those were the only degrees that were given. So generally, the Bachelor of Arts was your fundamental degree. That was the undergraduate grade, to use our term. And then if you wanted to become a master or a doctor, you could branch into theology or law or medicine. Now, it's interesting to see that young students that were taken in and put on a university track, after a while, there was a very highly structured pattern that they would follow. We could go into greater detail on this later, but just to give you a capsule of it, about 1300, a young candidate between ages 10 and 13 would receive a sort of basic grammar school education in the monastery, Latin, arithmetic, music, things of that sort. After that, they might be considered a candidate for the order, and then beginning after year 13, year 1 of your education would be logic and what they called philosophia rationalis. In other words, just the use of your brain and a sort of familiarity with the physical and intellectual world. This would be 2 years. The next 2 years would be philosophia naturalis. This is what you and I would call general science, which included things like ontology, which is the study of being as such, cosmology, the study of the physical world, including astronomy, psychology, study of the mind, the internal world of a thinking being, and then metaphysics, which literally means beyond the physical world, where you deal with things getting very close to God, like goodness, truth, beauty, oneness. So those are your first 4 years. Following that, year 5 is philosophia moralis. That's what you and I call ethics. And then with that fairly big chunk of material, the students were given a couple of years to digest and incorporate all of the previous learning, because they would be set to work teaching it to younger students. I mean, to this day, we accept the fact that one of the best ways of learning something is to teach it. And that's no exception here. Now, from that point onward, we assume that these people are, by year 7, professed members of the order. We've had a novitiate training stuck in there somewhere. And it's time to go on into theology. Now, at this point, there's going to be a judgment made by the superiors in consultation with the student himself. And those who are especially talented are tagged to go on for higher studies, and all of the others are simply put on the ordinary track to lead to priestly ordination, but without the specialized tasks that would allow a particularly talented preacher or confessor, or most especially a teacher. So the pro forma simplicis is the simple ordination course. After that, they were ordained to the priesthood, and they would simply live their lives as ordinary members of the community, possibly, if their talents warranted, to allow them one of those specialized ministries, but definitely not a teacher. The forma lectoratus was a formal entry into graduate school. Those people were definitely destined to a possible future of teaching in the universities, or for that matter, just going back to one of our own houses to be a teacher of some of the lower levels. Now, this system looks very structured, and it was. But it was remarkably effective at training some of the better scholars that we had during the Middle Ages. We'll be talking about some of these people in greater detail, but just to give you a few names, Gerard of Bologna was the first Carmelite to obtain a degree from the University of Paris. And he was promptly elected prior general. This is in 1297. Gerard is going to be a very different kind of general from the ones that we listed for you earlier on. He's going to be highly educated, extremely talented, a good writer, a good spiritual analyst, and he had a rather long tradition, a long career as general, including attending the Council of Vienne. Among the others, we have several contemporaries of Gerard. We have John Baconthorpe from England, who was one of our earliest Marian theologians. Guy Tereni from Perpignan. He's in southern France, very close to the Spanish border. He is going to follow Gerard as general. When Gerard steps down, Guy Tereni, another scholar, will be elected in his place. And then we have Siebert de Becke, who is most likely Dutch or German. He is somebody you want to remember because he's the one that organized the first serious ordinal for the Carmelite liturgy. An ordinal is simply a listing of proper antiphons, psalms, prayers, petitions for the liturgy on a given day. In other words, without someone like Siebert and an ordinal, we don't have an organized liturgy. At this point, please remind yourselves that we have a very distinctive Carmelite rite, which we brought from the Holy Land. This was a variation of the canons at the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, who had their own rite of the Roman Church. It's actually a transplanted rite. It's not an Eastern rite. Don't let anybody tell you that. This is transplanted from Rouen in northern France. And it was used by the canons in Jerusalem for 2 centuries. The Carmelite rite picked up many of those rubrics and prayers and a whole distinctive calendar of saints and commemorations. And we're still using that in Europe during these days. Finally, just to sort of tack him on here, although he's going to come from a couple of centuries later, another very good scholar is Thomas Netter of Walden. He was an advisor to King Henry V of England, the one who won the Battle of Agincourt. He was also tutor to the king's son, Henry VI, and one of the primary debaters of John Wycliffe, the heretic of the 14th century, I believe. So, by the end of the century, we're going to have something like 12 provinces of Carmelite communities, about 150 houses. And starting with just that handful of places, they're going to expand through France and Germany, Italy, into Spain, into England, Scotland, Ireland, knocking on the doors of Scandinavia. Among the other saints of this new century, we're going to get our friend Peter Thomas, very much unlike Albert and Angelus and Simon Stock from the first century. He's highly educated, a Frenchman, worked at being the Procurator General of the order in the mid-1300s, which means that he was essentially the ambassador or the liaison between the order and the papacy. During that period, the popes were living at Avignon, and so much closer to the greatest concentration of Carmelite houses. You can see that the Avignon popes used him as a diplomat. He was a great peacemaker, settled a war between Venice and Genoa, one of the many wars. He also settled a dispute between the papacy and the Kingdom of Naples. And then he was sent to Serbia to reconcile the Serbian church to Rome, which he did successfully. And then was sent to Constantinople to do the same thing, to reunite the Byzantine church to Rome. He made considerable progress, but not enough to finalize the deal before he died. He was just, to all accounts, an amazing diplomat. And yet, for all of the sophistication of his position, he continued to live a very simple life, never missed his prayers, even when he was traveling at sea, very easy talking with sailors and soldiers and ordinary people. No airs, no pomposity. He was on Cyprus when he died and was buried at the Carmelite church in Famagusta. You'll see, by the way, that he has a double cross staff there. He was actually named the Latin Patriarch of Constantinople, as well as Bishop of Crete. So he's probably the highest ranking Carmelite we have ever had. Another of the newer style of saints was Andrew Corsini, about whom we will say a lot more in the next lecture. Andrew was from one of the most noble families of Florence. He entered the Carmine right there on the banks of the Arno, was a very well-qualified teacher and well enough respected to be named provincial. But unfortunately, 1348 in Florence was the year of the plague, and a large percentage of his Tuscan province died, and Andrew was one of those who managed to hold the order together in spite of this great tragedy. The following year, he was named Bishop of Fiesole by the Pope, and turned out to be just a model bishop at a time when many bishops simply lived like nobility and had very little care for their people. Well, Andrew was a real noble who lived like a friar, insisted on continued simple living, visited every part of his diocese, encouraged the clergy, and actually kept them honest and well-behaved. Like Peter Thomas, he continued to act as a peacemaker, settling disputes. And when he died, he was buried in Fiesole because his local people loved him a great deal. But the Carmelites always wanted him back in Florence to be buried in the Carmine. And seeing as how his successor in Fiesole was his brother, the brother and a group of Carmelites made a raid on the cathedral during the night and stole Andrew's body and took it back to Florence, and you will still find Andrew's tomb in the Carmine. He's certainly an excellent model for what a bishop should be. So, that's our status by 1300. It's interesting to list these provinces in their order of seniority because it shows the order in which at least one house in the province was originally founded. The Holy Land province obviously is number 1. But now, since the fall of Acre, there were no Carmelites in the Holy Land. All of the mainland Holy Land communities had been extinguished. But they kept the name alive on Cyprus. The island of Cyprus, technically it's got its own name, but they always had the standard of the Holy Land province that was right there in the Cypriot cities like Famagusta or Nicosia. There was always hope of a new crusade when they could go back to the Holy Land and reestablish themselves in the wadi or up on top of the mountain, but of course it never came. So from now on, Holy Land province means Cyprus. Sicily was the second. England was the third. I'm not sure why Valenciennes was not counted here. Maybe it was not as successful a foundation as some of the others. Don't really know. Provence was number 4. That would be Les Aiguilades and Marseille to begin with. The first province on the Italian mainland is the Tuscany province. Remember, we start with Pisa, which is in Tuscany. This will also include Rome and parts of central Italy. Eventually, the Roman section will branch off and have a province of its own. And then in number 6, we have Francia. Please note this is not France as the entire kingdom. Francia is the region of north central France. It includes Paris, and of course that original foundation in Paris is part of that. But we already have a southern French establishment in number 4. And we're going to have another one in our top 12. Number 7 is going to be Lower Germany. Lower Germany, by the way, is north, not south. Lower Germany means downhill and downriver. So north of the Alps, including largely the Rhineland area, northern Germany, the Netherlands will be included in this in the early stages, and Belgium and the Netherlands were always very good to the Carmelites as well. So Lower Germany, whether it's Flemish, Dutch, or German speaking, is going to be a really good province. Lombardy means northern Italy. This branches off from the Tuscan province and flourishes. Aquitaine is western France. Number 10 is just the beginnings of penetration into Spain. Remember that Spain is still largely occupied by the Muslims. So in this particular case, Spain is more accurately Catalonia and the area around Barcelona. But that will also expand eventually to 4 substantial provinces. Number 11 is Upper Germany. This will be the southern area, closer to the Alps. This including Bavaria, Swabia, Baden. And then finally, we have a Celtic province of Ireland and Scotland. This would have separated off from England, the Celtic-speaking areas of Britain and Ireland. And of course, this is just the beginning. This is kind of taking the temperature of where we are at the end of the century. Now, things to watch. It wasn't all rosy. I've already mentioned 3 things that are going to begin to slip a little bit. So these are the sources of concern that will eventually lead in our next lecture and all subsequent centuries to things that need work. First and foremost is keeping prayer primary in Carmelite living. There's a tendency for it to become more routine, not the same vital, loving conversation that we might imagine for the hermits in the Wadi. Certainly not the kind of easy interchange that Teresa talks about in her writings. After a while, prayer for some is going to be an unpleasant duty that they ask for petitioned for exemptions from choir altogether. You know, tell me I don't have to go. Then there's poverty. That's number 2 of the tripod. Father Joachim says that poverty is the easiest of the 3 vows to cheat against, and it becomes more legalistic than spiritual. And then finally, I talked about that stratification of the community similar to secular society. You have your intellectual foam at the top of the community, the ones that have all of the permissions and documents and sources of first-rate performance. Then you have the lesser educated, the ordinary members of the community. Then you have students, novices, working brothers at the very bottom. In other words, it's not a harmonious community. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad community. Some of these were still pretty good. But it's not the ideal. So that takes us up to about 1300 as our cutoff year, and we will talk about what happens in reform efforts and other developments next lecture. Okay, thank you all.